Oxford University Press Higher Education Webinars. And now, Oxford is proud to present Joseph Trimble, Bear Spends Time in Our Dreams Now, Magical Thinking and Spiritual Considerations in Counseling Theory and Practice.
Good morning, everybody. And good morning from the great Pacific Northwest. What you see on the first slide is a picture of where I live, and although that's looks like a sunny day, actually it's always rains here. So, but anyway, you have an idea of where I live and where Western Washington University is. Let me begin with an interpretation of what bear means, and just to set the stage for this presentation. And I'll be reading a lot of my notes because I want to stay on schedule, so I apologize for that in advance. Bears have great spiritual significance for numerous indigenous peoples and nations. Many believe the bear is the keeper of dream time, and through dreams, knowledge, wisdom, and guidance are available to the person honored by the bear's presence. When bears awaken one's dreams, the dreamer can expect change and transformation in their lives. Bear medicine, thus, is believed to be a major healing source. On the medicine wheel, bear represents the West, which teaches primal instincts. The power of the West is where the sun sets and the day comes to an end. It is this direction connected with the power of the rain and of the water, which is used to purify. Joy and growth always follow the rain and releases ignorance. The long sleep for the bear brings winter dreams. Now I have two themes. The first theme is not necessarily the words of Margaret Mead, the esteemed prominent cultural anthropologist, but of her mentor, William Fielding Ogburn. She was a graduate student at Columbia, as some of you may know, and actually she started out to be a psych major, but after having classes with Ogburn and Francoise, she shifted her interest in the field of anthropology in the early 20s. Fielding Ogburn actually emphasizes over and over again, and I'm told this by Margaret Mead's daughter, Mary Catherine Bateson, who was my suite mate at Harvard. And so obviously I was privileged not only to have her as a suite mate, but as someone who told me great stories about her mom and of course her dad. The phrase is, never look for a psychological explanation unless every effort to find a cultural one has been exhausted. Now that quote can serve as a stimulus for lots and lots of discussions, but that's one theme that is embedded in this presentation. The next one is yet again from another prominent, esteemed cultural anthropologist, Clifford Geertz, who in his first book, The Interpretation of Cultures, talks about culture. And in this wonderful quote, he says, the Western conception of the person as a bounded, unique, more or less integrated, motivational, and cognitive universe, a dynamic center of awareness, emotion, judgment, and action, organized into a distinctive whole and set contrastively both against other such wholes and against social and natural backgrounds, is, however incorrigible it may seem to us, a rather peculiar idea within the context of the world's cultures. And any of you who have traveled and spent time with peoples from different parts of the world, when you start thinking about culture as it's conceptualized both in modern North American anthropology and in North America in general, it is quite an odd concept elsewhere. So keep that thought in mind. So I have three essential purposes in this presentation. The first is the importance of inclusive cultural empathy. Not individual empathy, but cultural empathy, and I'll get to that much later. The reframing of quote-unquote individualistic empathy into inclusive cultural empathy. And three, not necessarily the last one, to encourage the use of relationship-centered alternatives based on indigenous psychological perspectives and practices. Now, to set the stage for both the unique title of this presentation and the subsequent discussion that will follow this, I'd like to present to you a case study. This case study is published in one of the references that will be provided to you later, so you can get it in that publication, and it's essentially the same title of this talk. Basically, this is a story about a woman named Diane. Now, that's not her real name, and although she would not have been disappointed if I used her real name, but for the sake of anonymity, we decided that I would change her real name to Diane. Now, I met Diane when she was in her late 30s and a second-year graduate student in secondary education, where she was specializing in multicultural studies here at Western Washington. She appeared in my office one afternoon to ask if I could help her with a term paper on the history of American Indian boarding schools. Toward the end of our long first meeting, I agreed to read over a draft of her paper and provide her with some comments. A week later, she stopped by my office to show me the A she had received on her paper, and she said, with pride, "I'm going to frame this one." Diane was scheduled to graduate in June, so I asked her about her plans for the near future. Diane continued to talk with me about herself that day because she later told me, and I quote, she felt safe. She was born on one of the Northern Plains American Indian reservations. Her mother was an enrolled member of the tribe. Her father was non-Indian who taught in an off-reservation high school. When Diane was 3 years old, her parents moved to the Seattle area. She didn't remember much about her life on the reservation except that she had many relatives. She also admitted with some embarrassment that growing up, she knew very little about her tribe's customs, legends, traditions, and language. Her parents had decided it was best for her and her little sister to leave, quote unquote, those things on the prairie and in the past. Diane and her sister had little, if any, contact with the folks back home while growing up. A lot of what I'm going to read now are quotes from the many discussions that Diane and I had, and I want to use her words rather than my paraphrase of what she said, because I think it's a lot more powerful. She said, "About a year after I graduated from high school, I married a man who was older than me. John was handsome, well-traveled, smart, and he was native. Although, like me, he was raised in the city and had little contact with his home reservation. Our first year of marriage was blissful, but later I discovered he had a serious drinking problem when a friend told me she had seen him drinking with some guys in a park near the center of the city. He promised me he would seek help from a local clinic, and I believed him." She goes on to say, "A few months after this confrontation, I learned I was pregnant. John was overwhelmed with joy and excitement. 8 months later, I gave birth to a beautiful, healthy baby girl, and I named her after my mother. John adored her. Our mother brought new happiness to our marriage, and for a while, John and I were brought closer together. But sadly, John's drinking continued to the point where he would be gone for days. One night he came home drunk, and that was when the beating started. I did my best to defend myself. My bruises and cuts were noticeable. I started wearing heavy makeup when I visited family, but they could tell what was going on. John eventually lost his job. I thought that would turn him around, but he continued to drink, to beat and curse me, and to stay away from home for days. He always apologized and begged for my forgiveness. I foolishly hoped for the best, but it never came. Then late one night, 2 Seattle police officers knocked on my door to tell me that John had been in a street fight and was killed by some unknown guy. I collapsed on the doorstep. I was torn up with grief and anger. I felt so helpless. But I thought about our daughter, and I knew I had to be strong. John's death left Diane without financial resources, so she moved in with her younger sister and found a part-time job. Shortly thereafter, Diane lost her father to a massive heart attack and her mother passed away from surgical complications. For the next year, Diane grieved the loss of John, and she and her sister mourned the loss of their parents. During this sad time, Diane reflected deeply upon her lost Native heritage. Diane decided to enroll in a nearby community college to earn a degree, and she said, "I was so excited about taking classes and earning my degree. My life appeared to be heading in a positive direction." Just as she was slowly becoming optimistic about her future, Diane started to have very disturbing, confusing dreams. One night, she said, "A big black bear appeared in my dreams. He stood tall and straight, arms at his side, and looked at me with no expression before slowly fading away." This dream woke me up. I was frightened, but then again I wasn't. I thought about the bear dream for the next few days. I felt the bear was trying to send me a message, maybe telling me that I didn't do enough to stop my husband from drinking and hitting me, but I wasn't certain. She goes on, "For the next week, the bear appeared in my dreams every night, still without expression, doing or saying anything. He didn't seem to be trying to scare me because he did nothing but look at me. Then one morning, I was standing in front of my bedroom or bathroom mirror getting ready to go to work, and I looked up and saw the reflection of the bear standing a few feet behind me. I was so frightened and alarmed that I screamed. My sister came running and found me shaking and crying. She helped me to the edge of my bed and put her arms around me. When I calmed down, I told her about my dreams and seeing the bear in the mirror standing behind me. My sister then told me she also had been dreaming of a bear and had been very hesitant to talk with me because she thought her dreams were a bit crazy. She told me what the bear looked like and how he would just stand there and stare at her. After my sister's description and the vision in the mirror, I decided to confide in my close friends. I knew they would understand and try to help me. One of my friends suggested I see a clinical psychologist because someone she knew and trusted. She thought the counselor might be able to help me understand my dreams and how I might deal with them. I was hesitant, but I trusted my friend's recommendation and was comforted in part because the counselor was a woman. The counselor was kind, gentle, a good listener, soft-spoken, not pushy, and I appreciated her approach and style. I waited until our third session to tell her about my dreams. As I told her about the bear, I noticed she was looking at me strangely. She didn't quite understand what I was telling her. By the time I finished the story, our time was up, so we made another appointment. I returned to her office a week later, excited that she might help me understand my bear dreams and vision. The counselor told me she had given my story and experiences considerable thought. The counselor told me I had experienced some very difficult times, and these experiences would wear down the emotions and psychological strength of most people. She said she had come to the conclusion that I was experiencing a form of post-traumatic stress, which had led me to a state of what she called acute personality disorder. I was furious with her words and assessment of me. I told her I wasn't crazy or emotionally disturbed, that the bear dreams were real. Why would my sister have them? Was she crazy too? I yelled. I told her I never wanted to see her again and stormed out of her office. She followed me and tried to calm me down, but it was useless. A few days later, she called and left messages to return her call, but I ignored them. At that point, I wasn't sure what to do or who to turn to for help. The bear dreams hadn't stopped. One of my friends, who was a member of a tribe in western Washington, suggested I see a traditional Indian healer. I knew very little about Indian healers, but my friend knew a reputable and competent one. She had been to many of his ceremonies and knew many people he had helped. I thought about the possibility for a few days before I asked my friend to see if the healer was willing to work with me. He was, so my daughter, my sister, and a few friends headed out to a nearby reservation for a visit with him. He was a kind and gentle man who made us feel very welcome in his home. the end of our first visit, he set a date for the ceremony. He gave us instructions for preparing our minds and bodies during the week before the healing ceremony. The ceremony would last about a week, he said, so we would need to take time off from work and find someone to care for my daughter. The week went by fast. We followed the healer's instructions closely and arrived back at the reservation prepared. We stayed in the longhouse from early dawn to late in the evening. There was lots of drumming, dancing by small groups of people, singing and chanting in long periods of silence. The healer was always in the center of the room, cloaked in a robe, and sitting or lying on blankets on the floor. We sat around him. Several times the image of the bear appeared in the room, just as he did in my dreams, standing there with no expression, his arms at his side, looking directly at us on the floor. And then he would fade away. The healer knew who he was, and at one time invited him to come closer and sit with us. Towards the end of the fourth day, the bear appeared again. We all were very tired, so we didn't notice him at first. This time, he was standing closer to us. He slowly lifted his arms waist high and spread out his paws to us, as though greeting us and telling us he was friendly. I felt that immediately. The healer stood up and moved toward the bear. They stared at one another for the longest time. Then the healer held out his hands with his palms up, just like the bear. And the bear smiled. Yes, he actually smiled from ear to ear. And it was such a warm and beaming, friendly smile. Then he faded away. The healer turned to us and said he knew who the bear was and why he had come into our lives. He wants to protect you from harm and evil, the healer said. The bear is one of your spirit animals, and he has taken on the spirit of your former husband. Your husband has appeared in this way in your dreams to ask for your forgiveness for the way he was when he was with us. He's deeply sorry for the pain he caused you and your sister and daughter. He's not begging you to accept his apology, but he hopes you will forgive him. He's not the person he was when he was with us. The spirits of the ancestors have taken him in and helped him with his earthly problems. He is filled with remorse and sadness for the way he treated you. If you and your sister are willing to accept his forgiveness, he won't come around anymore. Diane summarized what happened next. I could see that the healer had insight and understanding of the bear experiences and vision. I knew it. I looked at my sister and without hesitation we nodded yes to one another. The healer smiled. Yes, we wanted to forgive John and close the circle of sorrow that had spread out so far in our lives. The healer stood and took us by the hands and formed a small circle. Then the bear slowly appeared in the middle of the circle and turned around to each of us with open paws and smiling face. We drew the circle closer around him. We touched him or blended in with the spirit. I'm not really sure what happened, but at that point I experienced overwhelming joy, love, relief, freedom, a state of oneness I had never experienced before. It gives me chills just to tell you this. The whole experience was reassuring because we knew we didn't experience our grieving, sorrow, and fears alone. There were people who cared and spirits looking over us. After the ceremony was over, we had a wonderful feast at the healer's home. People kept coming in the house with food and gifts of all kinds. We were overwhelmed with their affection and generosity. It was so heartwarming. The next day, we sat with the healer, and he reviewed the 4 days we spent together. When he finished, he gave each of us a small beaded pouch and told us to keep it with us at all times for protection, to help us stay in touch with our spiritual guides and ancestors. The weeks and months that followed our healing were filled with peace and happiness. My sister enrolled at the local community college, so we were able to go together. Our friendship expanded to include lots more Indian people. We were invited to powwows, ceremonies, and other get-togethers. The most important thing that's happened is that the bear still comes into our dreams. But instead of standing there, he would smile and bring us great joy. Yes, Bear does come in my dreams now, and I truly look forward to the experiences. I know he is protecting us and helping us grow. So that's the end of my story for now. Indeed, the appearance of the bear in our dreams and in the bathroom mirror startled and mystified Diane. I think it would startle and mystify anyone. It made no sense to her, although she was sure she wasn't crazy. Motivated by anxiety and a need to understand her experiences, she talked to her friends, which led to the recommendation to see a clinician, or as she referred to her, as a counselor. It seemed reasonable to see a clinician, although she had little knowledge about what she was supposed to do or what the outcomes would be. But startled by the clinician's assessment, her experiences with traditional therapy left her angry and more puzzled. Her decision to see a healer was prompted by her need for answers to the bear's presence in her life and the hope she would receive some sense of comfort and resolve. There's a wonderful ending to this story, and I still stay in touch with Diane from time to time because she remarried to a lovely man, and they have another child. She teaches in a high school, public high school in the greater Seattle area, and she's thriving. About 3 months after the experience with the healer, she decided to call the clinician and fill her in on what happened with her life, as well as to apologize for the way she reacted to the clinician's diagnosis. So she made an appointment with her. When she went into the clinician's office, the clinician was really pleased to see her. So Diane told her what had happened, told her about how angry she was, and she apologized. And at that point, the clinician looked at her and said, I apologize too, because I should have been much more sensitive to who you were, and what you were experiencing. If it's okay with you, I would like to spend time with the healer to learn more about how he heals people who are of Native background. Diane said he would love to meet with you too. And since that time, she, the clinician, and the healer worked, or that is, they worked together for a number of years before he passed away about a year or so ago. Now, Diane's clinical experience and the diagnosis she received raises what Paul Peterson, prominent cross-cultural psychologist and counseling psychologist, states, when we experience or hear stories like that, and his first point is, when does a specific psychological theory provide valid explanations? What are the cultural boundaries? Which psychological patterns always appear? Which patterns only sometimes appear? Recall that what the clinician did was pathologize the dream content, but the healer viewed it as a source of strength. So let me talk with you, or share with you some other information about magical thinking, magic, and how it relates to this whole notion of what cultural empathy can and could be. We all are familiar with P.h.D's stages of cognitive development, and here in this slide we see the 4 stages that he emphasized and the psychological or psychosocial processes that occurred during each one of these stages. And in the pre-operational stage, he observed, as other Piagetians and other developmental psychologists will point out, that speech becomes more social, less egocentric. The child has an intuitive grasp of logical concepts in some areas. Concepts formed are crude and irreversible. It's easy for a child at the pre-operational stage to believe in magical thinking because it increases. Reality is not firm. Perceptions, more than anything else, seem to dominate judgment. Before we get into the working definitions of magic, and these come from Nimrod and Rosen, which is referenced for you in the list that will be provided for you. I think we all know that magical thinking is present in the lives of most, if not everyone. Certainly in other third world countries, magical thinking is something that occurs without people really thinking that it's magical thinking. It's just a part of the way you deal with life on an everyday basis. But our children growing up see animals in cartoons, speaking in English, French, Japanese, and they actually believe, for some reason, maybe not surprisingly, that animals do talk. Books are filled with, children's books, that is, are filled with animals talking in English as though they're capable of doing it. Additionally, words that we use sometimes can directly affect the world we live in. You all know the phrase, speak of the devil and he'll appear. Step on a crack and you'll break grandma's back. It's referred to as thought-action fusion, where negative thoughts seem to, or apparently, or can cause harm. How many of you have lucky charms, wear lucky clothing? How many of you who played sports in high school and college, well, in my case, in college, I played football and ran track, we didn't change our socks or our athletic supporters for fear that we would lose. And I recall vividly one day when we were on a winning streak and we had lost a game to our arch rival, when one of the players stood up in the locker room and said, I want to know who washed his socks, because whoever did, that's the reason we lost the game. But we also realized that certain activities perceived as risky, such as using a public toilet, hand washing, crossing a certain street, eating certain foods, etc., somehow or other are going to cause negative things to happen in our lives. Nemiroff and Rosen use 5 points to define magic, and I should interject here. I often wondered why we psychologists haven't looked into magic and all that it means and the effects that it has in our lives on a daily, if not annual basis. Nonetheless, it seems to be an area that has not been truly explored to any great depth. But Nemiroff and Rosen say it's an intuitive, possibly universal aspect of human thinking. And secondly, it doesn't make sense. Contemporary science typically relies on subjective experience and involves the assumption of the correspondence between some subjective internal world and the world of reality. And it may serve, as Nemiroff and Rosen say, important cognitive, emotional, social, and adaptive functions. And it involves the sympathetic principles of similarity and contagion, a notion of imperceptible force that carries, drives, provides mechanisms for effects. According to Fraser, magical thinking relies on 2 laws. The law of similarity, where an effect resembles its cause. Something happens, and an association is made. The law of contagion, where things which were once in physical contact maintain a connection even after the physical effect has been broken. And this gets to this notion of sympathetic magic, which is the manipulation of effigies or similar symbols or tokens that can cause changes to occur in the thing the symbol represented. And we know that every culture, just about every culture, certainly the ones that I'm aware of, have such tokens, symbols, or effigies. Magical thinking underlies a vast, often unseen universe of small rituals that accompany people through every waking hour of the day. Somehow or other, it's the feeling and belief that our thoughts and actions can somehow control things. It's the sort of opposite of helplessness that often accompanies depression. Therefore, magical thinking for many is reality, and therefore it's not magical, it's a magical belief. People who hold magical beliefs or engage in magical behavior are often unaware that their thoughts and actions are both unreasonable and irrational. but they're unable to rid themselves of such behavior for fear, and you can fill in the blank there. As some of you know, I may not know, I'm of Lakota Indian background, so it was not uncommon, in fact it was something that occurred all the time, that when a man went into battle, he would decorate his shields with various designs that were intended to protect him from harm. And these visions that you see in this slide actually are just that. They come through dreams that sometimes are interpreted by a, what we call a Lakota Heoka man or a Wiki man, and who says this is what this means, and you put this image on your shield and that will protect you. All indigenous cultures had some variation of this, a charm, an amulet, a symbol. So let's talk about magical thinking in contemporary and alternative medicine. Stevens points out that many of today's complementary or alternative systems in healing involve magical beliefs, manifesting ways of thinking based on principles of cosmology and causality that are timeless and absolutely universal. So similar are some of these principles among all human populations that some cognitive psychologists and scientists have suggested that they are innate to the human species, and this suggestion is being strengthened by current scientific research. And that may be hard for some of you to believe, but there are actually some people that are looking into this in more detail. But let's shift for a moment to the DSM-3R diagnostic classification. The person believes that his or her thoughts, words, or actions might or will in some manner cause or prevent a specific outcome in some way that defies the normal cause of effect. That's right there. I'm going on and I'm quoting, as you can see, magical thinking is seen in children, in people in primitive cultures, and in schizotypal personality disorders, schizophrenia, and obsessive compulsive behavior. So the DSM, all series of the DSM make this really clear, although I'm very curious about what the next version will say about magical thinking. We certainly know that in classic, neoclassic, neo-Freudian psychoanalysis, the notion of animistic thought and belief was tied to obsessional neurosis, where the same kind of magical thinking occurs as a symptom. And Neo, and certainly Freud, and those that followed his ilk, were fairly firm about the idea that magical thinking somehow was indicative of neurotic behavior. There have been some efforts to measure this, and here's some items selected at random, actually, from a scale developed by Rawlings, Claridge, and Freeman called the Schizotypal Personality Scale. Look at these. Do you believe in telepathy? When in the dark, do you often see shapes or forms even though there's nothing there? Does your own voice ever seem so far away? Do you have vivid dreams that you disturb your sleep? Do you believe that dreams can come true? Do you ever feel that your thoughts don't belong to you? Do you ever have a sense of vague danger or sudden dread for reasons that you do not understand? And the scale items go on and on. I've showed the scale. Actually, I had many of my colleagues from nearby reservations here in Western Washington and back in South Dakota and up in Alaska, where I'm currently doing research with Eskimo populations, look at these items, and they will laugh when I tell them that if you score a certain way, you're going to have this personality disorder, and they will often say to me, well, I could say yes to all these things. There's another scale developed by Ekblad and Chapman. It's an old scale, but it's still used, believe it or not. It's called the Magical Ideation Scale. Some people can make me aware of them just by thinking about me. I have noticed sounds on my records that are not there at other times. I sometimes have a feeling of gaining or losing energy when people look at me or touch me. I've had the momentary feeling that I might not be human. If reincarnation were true, it would explain some unusual experiences I have had. The scale, according to Ekblad and Chapman, measures thought broadcasting, passivity, auditory hallucinations, thought withdrawal, aberrant beliefs, visual hallucinations, and thought reading. These scales are really interesting, and if you're looking for an interesting exercise for your classes, you might want to administer this to your students to see how they respond to them. But now let me shift to one of the underlying themes and objectives of this presentation. What is cultural empathy? And Ridley and Lingle, Chuck Ridley at Texas A&M has been doing a lot of work in this field. And you define it as the learned, and this is an important part of this, the learned ability of counselors to accurately gain an understanding of the self-experience of clients from other cultures, an understanding informed by counselors' interpretation of cultural data. Cultural empathy also involves the ability of counselors to communicate this understanding effectively with an attitude of concern for culturally different clients. Easily said, extraordinarily difficult to do for many people. Cultural empathy, again, continuing on, is multidimensional. It's an interpersonal process. It does not depend on cultural similarity and neutrality of client and counselor. And most important, it can be learned. In the context of number 3, there's a running debate in the literature fueled by research findings of one form or another that says, in order for true cultural empathy to occur, the counselor and the client must come from the same ethnic backgrounds. The data is very mixed on this, and it's worth looking into in more detail if you happen to be interested in it. Saltzman is a cross-cultural psychologist, counseling psychologist, University of Waimanoa, points out very strongly that counselors and therapists should, quote, respect culture as a necessary psychological defense and design interventions accordingly. Promote interventions emphasizing meaning, construction, the community level, and support the collective community and individual construction of meaning that sustains adaptive actions. Support and assist individuals in the community in the identification of standards and values they identify with that promote adaptive action in current realities, and support and assist communities in cultural recovery through content analysis of traditional stories. Saltzman puts a lot into this statement, but I love it because it captures so many things, not the least of which is the construction of meaning that sustains adaptive action. It's always struck me that every cultural, it's certainly indigenous population that I've had the pleasure to work with, be among, and enjoy, have been dealing with the healing of what we might call emotional and psychological problems for centuries. And they have ways of doing it. And ironically, maybe not ironically, they work. I could spend a lot of time talking about that, but it works because the meaning and the construction of that meaning is what supports one's ability to adapt. So in drawing to a close, is it westernization or modernization? Westernized perspectives, which have dominated the field of mental health, must not become the exclusive criteria of modernized psychotherapy. So in concluding, the task, and this is a daunting one, is to construct a complex and dynamic balance of tendencies that a competent counselor or psychotherapist can manage without distorting the truth in any cultural context. And that's not easy to do. Finally, there's a wonderful book that was published in 2010 by British psychologist Eugene Sabatsky, entitled Magic in the Mind. It's a lovely book. In it, he states, and I quote, just as rational thinking helps us to cope with problems in the physical world, magical thinking and magical beliefs come to our aid when we deal with problems in our personal, social, and emotional lives. That is why, despite the popular view, magical thinking and magical beliefs, religion included, go well with common logic and are a useful complement to a scientific thinking and rational reasoning. It's interesting. When I started writing this paper and thinking about this several years ago, I talked with many of my colleagues. We have a department here of psychology of about 30 faculty, represent a wide range of interests. And to a person, they confessed, some quietly, some not so, that they actually engaged in magical thinking. Not necessarily daily, but that they did. So where's the line? When one becomes obsessed with engaging in magical thinking and resort to the use of magical beliefs, it certainly can be problematic, and I'd be first to say that. So with Sabatsky's quote, I conclude my presentation.
As a leader in higher education, Oxford University Press is committed to broadening the ways in which faculty can share and discuss cutting-edge research in the discipline. Our Psych Talks and Cultural Psych Talks seminars showcase the authority, innovation, and excellence in the discipline. If you or someone you know would be a good candidate to lead a session, please reach out to us at jane.potter@oup.com. Bookmark our webinar site to view a schedule of our upcoming live webinars. Browse by session and sign up right on the site. To provide feedback on today's session, please visit the following link and fill out a short survey. You will automatically be entered in a chance to win $50 in OUP books from our Academic and Trade Division. Your feedback will also help us to refine our presentations going forward. And lastly, you can always visit our website to see Oxford's growing array of psychology titles. Thanks for visiting, and we hope to be able to connect with you again soon.